Computer's just being slow, I guess. Good evening. Welcome to episode 27 of Duval Rundown. My name is Gus Logue. I'm joined after the Jacksonville Jaguars' Week 9 game against the Philadelphia Eagles by Mia O'Brien and Ryan Hacker Green to break down what we just witnessed, which was a 28-23 loss in Philadelphia. It was Doug Peterson's second homecoming game after leading the Eagles to its first and only Super Bowl win back in 2017. And like the Jaguars did in 2022, they fell flat against the Eagles. They actually had a chance to win this game, even though it really wasn't that close. The Eagles outscored the Jaguars by over 200 yards, and they had over 200 yards rushing. And so, again, it probably wasn't as close as the game indicated, but the Jaguars did have a couple chances to win this game, including at the very end, and Trevor Lawrence threw an interception while targeting running back Dearness Johnson in the end zone. And so, Hacker, Mia, all of our viewers and commenters, welcome to the show. Let's get your guys' initial reactions. Why don't we start, Hack, with just what you saw today, what your reaction is after the final whistle.
Well, I can tell you what the talking point's going to be in this city, all right? And I'm not trying to start anything here. I'm just going with my observation. And I'm going to wait for Doug Peterson to talk as well, so I don't want to insinuate much. But this is what I saw 5 minutes ago. Doug Peterson mouthed the word why. You could see him say why on the sideline. And then when Trevor Lawrence walked off the field, there was no communication between Trevor Lawrence and Doug Peterson. Again, that was what I saw. All right, and maybe you guys saw something different. If you did, I apologize. But that's what I saw. And if that is what happened, that's a conversation in this city this week. Another heartbreaking loss. But that last throw's on Trevor. A wheel route to Dearness Johnson. Are you kidding me? Look, I get bashing Doug Peterson and Press Taylor. I did enough of that during the game. Trevor Lawrence, dude, a wheel route to Dearness Johnson? Yikes.
I actually audibly said aloud, they probably could run it here with 1:37 to go in the ball game. I'm like, hey, burn some clock. You're in the red zone. You have certainly in terms of health, I would argue your running back position at that juncture. Yes, I understand both Tank Bigsby and Travis Etienne were questionable coming into this game, but comparatively, outside of the tight end position, when you talk about the wide receiver and offensive line, if there was any position you could lean into at that juncture, it was the running back position. But ultimately, they didn't lean into the running backs to run the ball. They decided, oh, you know what? We're limited in terms of our pass catching opportunities given the current state of the wide receiver room. I'm not going to lie. The biggest surprise to me in this one was Brenton Strange. I don't think had a single target in this game. Luke Farrell, Gus, we talked about it on Duval Rundown on Thursday. We thought you'd see much more 12 personnel. If you did, I didn't see it. Certainly Evan Ingram 0 for 3 on his first 3 targets. That was shocking, although it did, I guess, happen in the Miami game as well, that the rhythm just wasn't there. And so ultimately, yes, it is that final play. Look, ultimately, there were 3 other players that ran routes. And so I'm sure the conversation is going to be that it was Trevor's decision to throw to the running back on the wheel route, which was the wrong decision. And I'm confident that Trevor Lawrence will take the blame for it. But yeah, why that was even an option, why that was even the play call, that part, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, Trevor didn't get a lot of help in this game, obviously, with Gabe Davis out, Christian Kirk out, Brian Thomas Jr. nicked up a little bit. I feel like Evan Engram might still not be 100% either because we've seen him have a tough drop and not really his best games in each of the past 2 weeks, even though I think he did have a pretty nice performance about 3 weeks ago. But like you were saying, Mia, like they didn't get the running game going at all whatsoever. And I was really shocked by the lack of usage with Brenton Strange, because not that he's a world beater by any means, but I actually thought that last week, especially after he had to come into the game with all the receiver injuries, I thought last week might have been the best game of Brenton Strange's career. And Press Taylor and plenty of other coaches and guys have talked up Brenton Strange as someone they want to continue getting more involved in the offense. And of course, sometimes things are just coach speak and you can't really take everything to be truth. But I thought that was really a situation where they did want to keep getting the ball to Brenton Strange over time. And especially in a situation like this, going against an Eagles defense that loves to run a bunch of nickel defense and a lot of too high coverages. So then there would hypothetically be a lot of space for a yak tight end like Brenton Strange to work underneath. And so the whole past week, I was kind of felt like the question in Jacksonville was, are the players not executing the scheme well enough, or are the coaches not putting the players in the best position to execute? And I thought that the answer was more of the latter, where it's on the coaches for not putting the players in the best position to succeed. I think tonight was a good example of that, where until the final fourth quarter drive that the Jags just had to try to win the game, Austin Trammell had the same amount of targets and catches as Brian Thomas Jr. The guy that you called up from the practice squad, where I don't even know, I assume he was undrafted, and I don't even know what college he went to. So the guy you just called up from the practice squad is getting the same amount of opportunities as your first round rookie receiver, who's like setting franchise records every single week. And so the Jaguars coaching staff, this isn't just tonight, but every week, that's like, they're the kind of coaching staff that's like, we have a great scheme and we're just going to put our players into the scheme, rather than the inverse, which of we're going to maximize all of our players' strengths and kind of cater our scheme to the players. And tonight you did not see the scheme cater to Brenton Strange. You did not see the scheme catered to Brian Thomas Jr. You did not see the scheme catered to Tank Bigsby or Travis Etienne. The scheme is just catered to whatever Press Taylor and Doug Peterson think is going to work just on the chalkboard, and clearly it didn't work on the field tonight. And so I think that goes back to kind of the final play in the final drive where Trevor did throw that interception. I feel like he's not really getting a lot of help. There was not a lot of separation tonight. Again, Thomas Jr. wasn't very heavily involved. There was a few drops. And so I think he was kind of like, what else do you want me to do? And I think that's kind of why maybe there was no communication between him and Doug Peterson after that happened, and why Lawrence, I feel like, has understandably so felt that he had to put on the superhero cape again and again, week after week, game after game.
I'll tell you what he shouldn't have done is thrown a wheel route to Dearness Johnson. All right, now, like Mia said, if that was even an option, well, that's on Press Taylor and Doug, I guess. But if you're Trevor Lawrence, man, you didn't have to do that, and you certainly didn't have to overthrow him. Dearness Johnson could have been Shaquille O'Neal, and he wasn't going to catch that ball. So I'm not going to back away from blaming Trevor for that. And then, again, when Doug Peterson looked like he mouthed the word why, and then there was no communication walking to the sidelines, interesting. And Gus, I'm going to give out some lottery numbers because I've been spot on. I predicted 34-20 on Gator Bites for Florida, Georgia. I got that right. And then you and I sat here 7 days ago, and I said, it doesn't matter if the Jaguars get the ball first in the first half or first in the second half. They're going to go 3 and out because it's what the Jaguars do. And the Jaguars, I don't know what they do in the locker room. I honestly don't. You defer to get the ball first in the second half to get the momentum. And I don't know. I asked Campo this last week. I'll ask him again, and I guess I'll ask him every week till they prove me wrong. I don't know what goes on in the halftime locker room because they never do anything with the ball in the second half. And 36 yards of total offense through 2.5 quarters. I mean, that's what we see under the Friday Night Lights. I mean, you see that in high school football. The offense was an embarrassment to the NFL for 38, 39 minutes of this football game. And because Nick Sirianni was borderline incompetent at certain points of this game and left like 8 points out on the field was the only reason why it came down to the end anyway. But then, of course, the Jaguars do what the Jaguars do. They can't win the game late, and that's now 6 losses by 5 points or less in a season that is just horrific at this point. There's really no other way to say it.
I did put a poll in our YouTube chat. If you are not watching on YouTube, if you're watching on Twitter or Facebook, X or Facebook, I guess I should say. Look, I know there's some of you who are going to say, why ask this? Which is why I made why ask this an option. are you blaming this loss on Trevor Lawrence? Because as the Jaguars got ready to start marching down the field on that final offensive series, I actually tweeted out a screenshot from a conversation with a good friend and a family friend as well, who, quite frankly, self-admitted was watching this game via the box score and via the ESPN app, and was like, then sent me the screenshot of Patrick Mahomes and Trevor Lawrence make the same amount of money, like, make this make sense. And I was like, have you watched the first half? And he said, no, I've been watching the box score. And I said, okay, well, that explains why you feel this way. With that said, especially with how this game ended, I know there are those of you who do want to blame Trevor, despite everyone who replied to that tweet of mine and said, how can you blame Trevor? And agreed with me that this loss, while certainly Trevor being a problem and Trevor throwing an interception on a wheel route in the end zone at the end of the game is certainly a problem, he is not the singular problem right now for this Jaguars team.
Right, like the other interception that he threw in this game literally just bounced off of Travis Etienne's hands. And so the question that I always have for people is, like, what do you want Trevor to do differently? Where, like, if Hacker wants him to not throw that wheel route, then sure, that's fair. But then, like, at that point, you're trying to go win the game, and, like, you got to give guys a chance when you're down by 5 and need a touchdown. And like anything before that, I don't really know what he could have done differently. Guys aren't getting open in under 2 seconds, and then after 2 seconds, he's getting pressured and still doesn't have anywhere to go with the rock. And so, like, people are commenting, stop standing up for Trevor. Stop. Like, I'm just telling you guys what I'm seeing. Trevor is a great quarterback, and he's getting held back by the team.
You know, look, I don't disagree that Trevor's a good quarterback, and I like the fact that he's here. But let's be honest about this. Doug Peterson and Press Taylor are probably not going to be here very much longer, and Trevor Lawrence is. And I'm not saying you guys, but I'm saying fans in general, most of them will flock to the notion of everything's Doug and Press's fault because we can wash our hands with them. Trevor's our guy because he's going to be here long term. Yeah, you make $275 million, and the offense had 36 yards in 2.5 quarters. Now, look, Doug Peterson and Press Taylor did not call a good game. They never do. In fact, I don't know what they do. I have no. Hold on, Alexa, stop. Thank you. Alexa's going off in the background. Give me a break, Alexa.
Alexa's fired up about the Jags, too.
Alexa is fired up about the Jags. Are you kidding me? But blame the play calling, yes. And go back on my Twitter this entire game, and I was very critical of Doug Peterson and Press Taylor. I'm not going to throw stones in a glass house. They deserve blame. But at a certain point, when you're making $55 million a year and you have 36 yards of total offense in 2.5 quarters, I think everybody deserves blame, and Trevor Lawrence is included in that. It was a failure across the board on offense for most of this game.
Hacker, did you call him Doug Taylor? According to Jason in the comments, you may have said not Doug Peterson and Press Taylor, but Doug Taylor. So,
well, Doug Taylor and Press
Rick
Peterson.
Nielsen.
How about
yeah,
that?
Press Peterson, Doug Taylor, and Rick Nielsen. Those are the primary culprits for so many.
And by the way, I haven't even gotten to Ryan Nielsen yet. Again, just an awful defensive performance. Just absolutely horrible.
We are going to get to the defense. Before we do so, I do want to call into question another note that I made earlier in the ball game with approximately about, this was about 3 minutes to go. Or no, sorry, this was with about 5 minutes to go in the first half. Tank Bigsby had 1 carry for 3 yards. Brian Thomas Jr.'s first touch came in the second quarter at the 8:46 mark. And as Squirrel 904 on X just pointed out to me, by game's end, nearly 3 hours later, those stats were not that different. Tank Bigsby finished with 8 carries for 22 yards, and Brian Thomas Jr., 2 catches on 4 targets for 22 yards. Common thread, you could argue, now certainly there are 7 losses that need to be accounted for here, but in the games in which the Jaguars offense struggled the most, and you can certainly lay the bulk of the blame on an anemic offense, what is the common denominator? Both of those 2 players not being involved enough.
All right, let's go over to the defensive side, because I feel like this game felt like a lot of games last year for the defense, where it was like the defense certainly wasn't great. They gave up a few big, ugly plays, but at the end of the day, based on the scoreboard, they probably did a good enough job to win the game if the offense had held up their own end of the bargain. But with that being said, A.J. Brown left the game with an injury. Saquon Barkley was in and out with his own injury. And, like, obviously the Eagles had a positive game script, and so they were just trying to win the game and put it away as opposed to putting more points on the board. And so what did you guys think of Ryan Nielsen's defensive performance just throughout all 4 quarters.
I made some notes about the defensive free agent class. Let me see here. No, I didn't make notes because there was no notes to make. Eric Armstead, man, look, I'm happy that he's a nice guy because he's, like we've talked about, he's getting dangerously close to the Hugh Douglas, Bryce Pop, Jerry Porter neighborhood as far as doing nothing and getting paid a lot of money. Darnell Savage, Ronald Darby at least showed up because he was using.
No, I would argue Darnell Savage showed up, Hack. He did have that really nice pass breakup in the first half.
Yeah, against
All
AJ.
right, I mean, I also saw Saquon Barkley run over him a time or two, but I guess Barkley does that. Ronald Darby, I thought, had a terrible game. I felt bad for Trayvon Walker and Ventrell Miller and Devin Lloyd to an extent, and Joshua Hines-Allen. Those were kind of the 4, right? 41, 44, 33, and 51, I thought played their tails off.
Well, 33 is Devin Lloyd.
Yeah, no, I thought Lloyd played all right.
Okay.
I thought he played well.
Are you including 23 then in that conversation?
Oh yeah, Foye. I guess I just expect Foye.
Because I would bring up Foye for the sole reason of why is he still being taken off the field on 3rd down in the first half? But then again, as I saw a couple people note, there were some also once again questionable substitutions in the first half on defense. Not as many in the second half, but when it's 3rd and long and Trayvon Walker and Josh Hines-Allen are off the field and Foye Oluokun is not on the field. Just, I don't know.
Yeah, this happened in the second half, like late in the 4th quarter when the Eagles were clearly just trying to turn out the clock with the run game. It was the first down of the drive, and Trayvon Walker wasn't on the field. I think Josh Hines-Allen is probably a better run defender, honestly, but he's one of your best run defenders. And speaking of Josh Hines-Allen, he also had a nice game. He had 2 sacks in the first half, and obviously was a little bit quieter in the second half, but that was kind of more of what you expected to see after he had only, I think, 3.5 sacks going into the game. But I like the player that kind of tells the story of the game for me is Ronald Darby, because I've said on this show multiple times that I was a really big fan of him in the offseason and as a free agent signee, but there hasn't really been anything throughout this entire season that's said that it was a good free agent decision. And honestly, it was kind of shouldn't have been that surprising because cornerbacks are one of the positions that fall off a cliff the most, like pretty much after running back, I guess. And so it's typically not great to rely on a cornerback who's on the wrong side of 30. And so I think that Jacksonville, for the whole season, but including this game, their depth has really just been a detriment to the defense, especially with Nielsen doing all these hockey rotations. But I think of the depth, especially in the secondary, like we saw it with when Tyson Campbell went down. Monteric Brown got benched for DeAndre Prince during the game last week. They just don't have enough bodies, especially to hold up in man coverage, like with the scheme that Ryan Nielsen wants to implement. But even without the scheme, like they just don't have enough bodies in general in the secondary.
And the frustrating thing is we all talked about this, particularly at pass rush. They don't have anything behind Walker and Hines-Allen, and that's very true. But we talked about the corner position, Campbell and Darby. How many times did we sit on various shows on 1010XL and talk about Stephon Gilmore and talk about trading for Marshawn Lattimore or doing something to bring a veteran corner in? And you're seeing it come to fruition now that a lot of these young guys just aren't ready. They're not getting the job done. Yeah, I thought Darby was bad today. Every big play Philadelphia made, you could argue, was Darby. Campbell, Dotson made a crazy play. I don't blame Tyson Campbell for that. But every other play you can blame Darby for, in my opinion. And it's just frustrating because, again, I get that salaries and people have to agree to come here. I'm just talking about from a media observation standpoint. We talked about pass rush, and we talked about the secondary the entire offseason, that we didn't think they had enough bodies there. And here we are 9 weeks in, and that's obviously the case.
I do think that some of the players who we naturally are going to point to as why are they on the football field, I'm thinking, of course, of the Jeremiah Ledbetter, Tyler Lacey combination, Miles Cole also getting some run today. I do think that if we're going to talk about on offense that the coaching staff is not putting them in a situation to succeed, I think you could say the same thing on defense. And that's not to defend those players, but I saw Jeremiah Ledbetter get into the backfield today. I saw him create pressure. I saw him make plays. Now, it's not going to show up in the box score necessarily, but I do think you saw more of a push from that interior, not nearly enough. But I do think, and Gus, I forget if it was you or who tweeted it during the game, Josh Hines-Allen's first sack was a direct result of Eric Armstead creating pressure from the interior. And that is where I can't help but come away from and say, and for those of you who are mad and say that we're coming up with excuses for Trevor, let me say this. if we are going to say that the system is failing Trevor, is it fair to say the system is what is failing these defensive players as well?
Yeah, I think so. I feel like there hasn't been anything to say otherwise. And I did want to say that I think it's fair to expect Jacksonville's defense to improve as the season goes on. It's pretty tough playing for not just a new defensive coordinator who's in his second season ever calling plays, but also just different position coaches across the board and teaching new techniques. Like the Jags have been a zone-heavy defense for the past several seasons. And a large part of that is actually because of their lack of depth in the secondary. But to go all of a sudden and flip a switch to a man-heavy defense is definitely really difficult, and especially when you don't just have like Pro Bowl caliber players lining the roster. And so I feel like it was reasonable just in general to expect Jacksonville to have better defensive performance in the second half of the season compared to the first. But with that being said, like that's just kind of a general assumption at this point. Again, there hasn't been anything specifically that we've seen from Nielsen's defense in the first 9 weeks of the season, the first 9 games of the season. That's like there's at least steps being taken in this department with this player. Like Jarian Jones is improving each week, which is good. But like I feel like that's kind of the only example of actual progress in terms of a specific player, and then in terms of just like the scheme helping out a player too.
Well, I mean, you allow 225 yards rushing or whatever it was. You're not going to win the game. And again, 28 points is not good, but it very easily could have been 36 because Sirianni, I think, left 8 points out there, 2 extra points and 2 field goals. Now, give Jacksonville credit for stopping them on the 2-point conversions and the couple of fourth downs. But I mean, the defense to me allowed 36 points. Philadelphia just didn't take advantage of that. But I agree, Mia. I think Ledbetter was okay. Tyler Lacey. And focusing on the positive for a moment, kudos to Joshua Hines-Allen, because a lot of people were critical about him this week, myself included, and he played his best game of the year. Trayvon Walker is a beast. I love what I've seen out of Trayvon Walker. Ventrell Miller is going to be a star. I mean, he's going to be an absolute star. I love, and I don't think this is orange and blue goggles here. I'm just talking about from what I see, man. I absolutely love everything about Ventrell Miller. So there are some positives. But again, I mean, when you're allowing 27 points one week, 28 points the next week, 47 to Buffalo, 37 here. I mean, is it a system failure? Is it they don't have the players? Is it a combination of the two? It's something because the defense is not very good right now.
It again comes down to, is this a circle peg being attempted to fit into a square hole or vice versa? That's kind of where I'm at across the board, whether it's the defense, whether it's the offense. Right now, there is just no continuity. And I think when you're in the locker room during the week like we are, I think what's very interesting is that comparatively to Jaguars teams I've covered previously, there is no fight. There's no disagreement among the players at the very least, because that's what we can see, because that's what's in front of us in the locker room. We're not privy to those meetings with coaches. It's not like this team has quit on each other. And that's where it's just so hard to wrap your head around. And Andrew Catalon said it at the end of the broadcast. I mean, this is what, the 5th loss that they have of their 7 that were by 5 points or less? Like, at some point in time, the ball has to bounce the other way for you. I think so many of us thought that when the Jaguars got the favorable call in favor of the Trayvon Walker scoop and score, which I certainly thought that Ventrell Miller got a little bit of a little touch on Saquon Barkley's ankle that may have been contact and would have ruled him down. I do think that ultimately so much of this, it's just so hard to wrap your head around, because if you're there in ball games and you say you just have to keep chopping away, ultimately, if it's just a failed ecosystem, then yes, you have to walk away from it, because I don't know if, if you're just going to keep trotting out there and doing the same thing.
Well, let's move this conversation forward a little bit into just what this game kind of means for the future. I think we can start with kind of the players in the locker room. There's a lot of comments right now in the stream about trading away Travis Etienne, and I don't really get that at all. I know that Mike Florio had a report a couple weeks ago, and I showed the report on the show, but Etienne is still under contract through 2025. And so just in general, NFL teams very, very rarely trade away players who aren't just going to be a free agent in like 4 or 5 months. And so I don't, even if Tank Bigsby has had a little bit of a mini breakout so far, and Dearness Johnson, despite the last play, is a reliable backup running back and special teams guy, it just doesn't like make sense to just trade away Travis Etienne for like maybe a compensatory day 3 pick like he did for Cam Robinson. Because the thing with Cam is that he is going to be a free agent in 4 or 5 months, and the team didn't have any future plans for him. But the future coaching staff for Jacksonville could have future plans for Travis Etienne in 2025 and maybe even beyond. So I don't really think that trading Travis makes any sense, even despite his underwhelming season. But do you guys think there could be any other movement before, I think it's Tuesday's trade deadline?
That's correct. I don't envision there being any other movement. I think Travis Etienne could have potentially helped his trade stock today, and he did not. And ultimately, I agree with you, Gus. I think that he's another carrot that can be dangled for a potential future coaching staff and or general manager should the Jaguars opt to move on from Doug Peterson and Trent Baalke. And so I don't think Travis Etienne's going anywhere. I do think that if anyone's going to be moved, it would be a contract that you're going to say goodbye to next year anyways, which would include Brandon Scherf. Of course, he's now banged up. He gutted it out today with a knee injury. I know so many of you in the chat don't want to hear positives right now in light of the 28-23 loss, but I do want to commend the Jaguars offensive line, who gave up just 2 sacks in this game, despite the fact that they did not have their left guard. Their backup left guard got carted off the field. Their center entered the concussion protocol briefly, but ultimately passed through. Their right tackle left the game. Their right guard was banged up. So, yeah, I don't think you're trading Brandon Scherf at this point by virtue of how banged up your offensive line is. And so, yes, I think the Jaguars stand put at the trade deadline. And ultimately, it's, hey, you know what? We'll roll with who we have. And if a new regime comes in, look, I can tell you guys, I've spoken to enough people around the league that if Doug Peterson and Trent Baalke were to be let go, I know you don't want to hear this right now, but this is an attractive position. You have an owner who's not afraid to spend money. You have a brand new shiny stadium that is approved and will be opening in 2028 when presumably you would be under contract. You do have a quarterback who has raw talent, which we will circle back, I'm sure, before we're done with this program, back to the quarterbacks. And so many of you want the chat therapy and want to discuss Trevor Lawrence. For me, that's where I look at this and I say, you know, like, what's the point in making any more moves at the trade deadline 3 days from now?
No, I agree with that. And I got to go quick here because I got to go get ready for the 5th quarter, which will be really good on 1010XL. I was getting some interesting texts from Leon, particularly after the Walker Little just absolutely got annihilated on that one play by Josh Sweat in the first quarter. So join us on 1010XL for that beginning around 9:15 tonight. I don't think they're going to trade anybody else. I agree, Mia, with Brandon Scherf. There was a report out last week that at least there might be some calls about him, but he's banged up at this point. Travis Etienne might want to consider playing better. You know, I mean, I think it's great that, you know, he's had good history here and he's a first-round pick and he was Trevor's teammate, but that guy has not played very well, man. I mean, the Miami fumble aside, the interception today, that was completely his fault. It's not been a good year for Travis Etienne. There's no doubt about that, but I still think he has a future here, at least for 1 year. Keep in mind, last year's his last year under contract here. They picked up the 5th-year option, but he's scheduled to become a free agent after next season, so we'll see what happens there. And the message this week is it sucks that we have 8 games to go, and you're dangerously close to losing is kind of a good thing for many different aspects, not just draft positioning, but if you want change, if you want different people in charge, I mean, let's at this point let this thing get as bad as it possibly can get. And the owner will be forced at that point to make change. I mean, if you win 4 out of 5 at the end, that gives you hope going into the offseason, right? Well, yeah, they finished 6-11, but you know what? They won 4 out of 5, and that gives them some positive momentum going into the offseason. I can just see the spin on that. They're the biggest disappointment in the league. They're one of the worst teams in the league. And at this point, at 2-7, again, dangerously close to winning games is a bad thing.
Well, that was going to be my next question, is just about change and when we expect it to happen. Because pretty much after every post-game show we've done, I've been asking people when they expect Doug Peterson to possibly be let go. And so honestly, at this point, I don't think it's going to happen until after the season ends. Maybe we see change during the bye week just because that's a natural spot for it to happen. But I don't know. Before the season, I was like when they come back from London, I could see that making sense. But right now, I think that Doug is going to be gone, but I don't think it happens until January. But what's y'all's read on that right now?
Yeah, I mean, I heard from some people that if it looked ugly today, maybe that expedited the process a little bit. And certainly through the first half, I was very much leaning in that direction of, oh my goodness, they may leave him in Philly. Doug Peterson could be fired by the Eagles twice, which would certainly be a storyline. But ultimately, and I don't want to make a comparison, and you both, I know this is painful to bring up, but ultimately, much like Billy Napier and the conversation we had surrounding the Florida-Georgia game yesterday, so many of us after that game came to a close, if your players aren't quitting on you, then can you really pull the plug completely? Now, I say that, and I do think there's a difference because obviously one's a professional team, one's a college team. And I do think Billy Napier's players not quitting on him is different than the Jaguars not quitting on Doug Peterson. Because ultimately, these are paid professionals. Yes, certainly with NIL, I would argue those student athletes are also paid. But it feels different. Does that make sense? I know for both of you, as Gator fans and a Gator grad in you, Gus, I'm curious your take on that because I think there's a difference. Now, certainly part of it in Gainesville is the idea of the buyout, and we don't know the contract situation with both Doug Peterson and Trent Baalke and how many more years they have on their deal. But I would assume we're getting towards the end of both of those contracts. And so you're at that point where either you're going to give them both extensions or you're going to say goodbye and go in a different direction because you wouldn't want them entering lame duck or even just a year or two left on their contract and it's moving in this direction.
The difference to me, Mia, is Billy Napier, there were no expectations for Florida. People thought they were going to be awful, right? And a month and a half ago, people thought they were going to be awful after the A&M game. And that team has obviously gotten better. And now they're on their third string quarterback. And they still battled one of the best teams in the land yesterday till about 5 minutes to go in the fourth quarter. So I do think there's a difference there. With Doug Peterson, there are expectations. You spent so much money on so many guys this offseason, and you're 2-7, and you'd be picking like second or third in the draft if it was right now. So to me, there's a little bit of a difference there. I agree they're still playing hard. But this is the National Football League, man. I mean, every game comes down to 1, 2, 3 plays, and week after week after week, the Jaguars are not doing it. And even in the win against the Colts, they tried to give that one away. 34-20 with 5 minutes to go, and it takes a Cam Little game winner to win that game. So I get the comparison, and I'm not saying that I totally disagree, but just based on expectations, injuries, all of that, I do think it's a little different between Napier and Peterson.
So, Hack, let me leave you with this because I know you got to jet off for the fifth quarter coming up at 9 o'clock on 1010XL and 92.5 FM. Who's more likely to be here in the fall of 2025? Is it Billy Napier or is it Doug Peterson?
As it stands right now, I don't expect anybody to be here, none of the above, which would make our jobs fascinating beginning in January if Florida's got a new head coach and the Jaguars have a new head coach. But if you're asking me who's most likely, I'd probably say Billy Napier right now. I probably would.
That feels like a good time to say goodbye to Hacker before we put a bow on this.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't have anything else to add, especially since I wasn't even aware the Gators had a game this weekend. I don't know really what you guys are talking about, but yeah, Hacker, thank you guys. Thank you for coming on. Make sure to catch Hacker, Leon Searcy, and Coach Dave Campo, 92.5 FM. They're doing Island Girl Cigar Bar, right? Again?
That's next week. That's next week after Minnesota. And save the tape, Gus. The Jaguars will get the ball first on the opening drive next week or at the beginning of the third quarter, and they will go 3 and out because it is what the Jacksonville Jaguars do. I'll see you guys later.
Adios, Hacker. Fantastic. Well, before we put a bow on this show entirely, Gus, I did want to revisit the poll that I put in our MyBookie Digital Studio chat line. For those of you who have not been able to vote, you still have time to do so. But with about 150 votes cast, a couple more of you just voted, 153 votes. Are you blaming the Jaguars' 28-23 loss on Trevor Lawrence? 47% of you do say yes. 43% of you say no. 10% of you say, why ask this?
You have me psyched out. I thought it was going to be a majority of people saying it wasn't his fault, but
I thought so too. And ultimately, because when I tweeted out what I did, and granted that was before the interception, that I had multiple family and friends texting me saying, "Oh my God, like he's the problem," and I was like, I mean, if you're watching this first half of this game, I mean, look again. I don't want to say that he is not a problem, because throwing an interception on a wheel route, making the decision that he did at the end of the ball game is a problem. But I also can't help but look at the entire landscape of the National Football League right now. And I see guys like Jared Goff and Baker Mayfield who were left for dead, who are out here not throwing a single incompletion for series at a time. And that's where I can't help but come away from this and say that Trevor Lawrence has more God-given ability than both of those two players. I know all three of them were selected first overall, which is why I bring them up. And look at the ecosystems that they're in, and they are succeeding. And so for those of you that are in the comments that are out on Trevor, look, maybe you get your wish and a new a new offense coordinator, new head coach comes in, and we see the same. And if we do, okay, fine, you can blame it on Trevor. Ultimately, he may not be a generational prospect. He may require having a solid run game as an option, having a solid offensive line, and that is okay to say as well.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to transition into just chat therapy, especially as our one guy, Reedy.
Oh, we got a couple people in chat therapy that are just dying for it right now. And thank you to the over, I think, 1,900 of you who are tuned in right now.
Right.
We've got over 1,600 of you on X alone, and I know another 150 or so of you on YouTube.
Yeah, so get into the stream chat and ask any questions. There's been plenty of venting already, but if you have any questions specific for me or Mia, then let us know. There was one question earlier that I thought was interesting, which was, I can't find it, but someone was asking what our opinion is on Tony Boselli as Jaguars EVP, because that's been kind of a hot rumor going around the past week or two, is that assuming Balky ends up leaving the team, I guess, or is fired from the team, then Tony Boselli, I think the rumor is that he has a strong interest in becoming the EVP, the executive vice president of football operations for Jacksonville, and basically being what some people like to say the Mark Lamping of the football side, which really doesn't make a lot of sense. But I guess if you're really trying to dumb it down, then he's like the top guy in the football world for the Jaguars. It's like Tony Boselli is having all the conversations with Shad Khan, the owner. And so I think a lot of people are kind of on the fence, or like one way or another, about this, because obviously Tony Boselli is a beloved Jaguar figure. He's the first and only Hall of Fame player who's the first pick in 1995 or the 94 expansion draft. So he currently hosts or co-hosts Jaguars Happy Hour, and does other stuff with like the Jaguars radio station. So anyway, Tony Boselli, obviously a Jaguars legend, but is that enough to want him to be the EVP and like the head honcho for a football franchise? Just the fact that he was a great player and is like a figure in the community now, because I feel like he probably doesn't have quite enough executive experience to really be a true candidate for that position personally.
Yeah, I don't want to speak out of turn for Tony. What I can tell you is whoever dropped off the Boselli for EVP buttons at 1010XL, we see you and we hear you. Yep, that happened last week. So I see you, Duval, out there stumping for Tony. I think that if you take Boselli out of it and you want to have the conversation about bringing in a Mark Lamping on the football operations side of things, that I could see. I'm curious who that person would be, though, because ultimately, I think that whoever it is, and certainly this was the attempt when Shad Khan brought in Tom Coughlin back in 2017, was to bring in someone who not only understands the franchise, but who is part of the community itself. And I think that that's important. To give you an analogy, I mean, I'm not going to, sit here and tell you otherwise. I think part of why I was able to transition from local news to 1010XL was A, because I was already working part-time at 1010XL, but B, because I'd gotten to know so many of you, was already on the beat, and it was a seamless transition. And I think we've seen, whether it's TV or radio, we've seen other people come into the Jaguar space. And if you aren't brought up in it, or if you haven't spent X amount of years in it, it's a little bit more difficult to understand the situation. And so unless you were to completely wipe the slate clean, which I am in favor of, by the way, and I've heard that from more than one person in the building at Everbank Stadium and the Miller Electric Center, that this could require a complete clean sweep where you're interviewing everyone once again, from the nutritionist to the marketing girls to the front office clerk. Everyone has to re-interview, because ultimately this is a systemic situation. This is not the first time the Jaguars have had lofty expectations and have fallen short. That has been through multiple regime changes that they find themselves at this juncture. And so it has to be something that's deeper rooted.
All right, this question comes from Padawan Prince on YouTube. Thoughts on how Trevor is to blame when we have Trammell returning kicks and ETN tipping checkdowns? All I'll say is that a lot of fans are results over process, which makes sense because you're just watching the game for 3 hours on Sundays, checking your fantasy lineups. So again, it's fair, but I don't know. I'll probably be posting a film review of Trevor's game later this week on Twitter. So go to @Gus_Logue for that. And you can get my thoughts on the process over the results. The next question is from Mimi on YouTube asking, do you think Parker Washington isn't a great receiver as well? A lot of small mistakes from him today that added up. I think Parker is actually a pretty solid receiver. I think he's definitely belongs in the NFL. I don't know. I don't think he's going to make a Pro Bowl in his career or anything like that, but I think he's going to stick around for a little bit because he's clearly tough. He's clearly shown a lot of, I guess, football intelligence growth over the past year. Not that he didn't have any coming into the league, but just because Jaguars coaches talked about this in the past week or two, how he knew the system in his rookie year, but then to really understand like choice routes and when to run certain routes against certain defensive looks and like the why really behind each route in the whole system didn't really click for him until going into this year. So I think there's a lot of good characteristics about Parker, and like he definitely had a couple of small mistakes tonight. One of them was just him jumping like too early on a play that was actually probably open that Trevor was trying to hit him on the corner route from the slot. But yeah, he's still just a second-year receiver who was like, what, maybe a fifth-round draft pick.
Yeah, he was a sixth-round pick.
One of the first starts of his career. And so, yeah, it wasn't a great Parker Washington night, but I do think that, again, he's definitely belongs in the NFL, and I think we'll see better things from him going forward.
Ultimately, again, Parker Washington hasn't had all that many reps from Trevor Lawrence. I wouldn't think, at least. I mean, we're not there for that part of practice during the week. But with Christian Kirk healthy, he's not seeing many reps with 16 outside of training camp. And they did make a much more conscious effort for the sake of onboarding this offseason to try to get all receivers reps with Trevor Lawrence in case they were thrust into the role that now we see Parker Washington once again having to be in. And so I think that a lot of that miscommunication and some of the miscues you saw tonight were just timing based. And it's two players who've had 1 week of practice largely together in a role that is so essential to the structure of this offense. And I think Parker Washington offers you some things that, quite frankly, I don't know if Christian Kirk does. You could make the argument that as a ball carrier, he is, people have said it, and it's been made known, like he has his lower body looks like a running back's. I mean, right. And then you couple that with one of the most historically low drop rates in college football history and his ability to flex out and be more of a pure route runner at the X wide receiver position. Now, do you want him splitting out all the time? No, he's a slot receiver. But at the same time, I think he does give you that inside-outside versatility. Not that Christian Kirk doesn't, but I think you can do more with Parker Washington, if that makes sense. And that's not to say that Christian Kirk isn't a good player and isn't a totem pole of this offense. I just think that Parker Washington can give you something that from a sixth-round pick to be able to plug and play him and see at least some semblance of success in this first outing from him in 2024 in an extended role, I think that's a win.
Mm-hmm. I would push back a little bit on the inside-outside versatility because, like, I think that we saw on a couple of occasions tonight that when he was lined up on the outside on one-on-one coverage, he just isn't really big enough, honestly, to just it's not really about creating separation. It's just about being able to bring the ball in, especially on like routes where you're just running a comeback or like a hitch or a route where you're just stopping and waiting for the ball, as opposed to crossing routes and a bunch of other stuff you're able to do on the move from the slot. And I think that's the other thing worth pointing out about Parker tonight is he was playing a lot more on the outside because they had Austin Trammell as a slot receiver tonight. And so I think, again, like once Gabe Davis and Brian Thomas are healthy and Parker Washington is like just a slot guy, then you'll definitely start seeing better performances. But even if I was pushing back against the inside-outside thing, Mia, I definitely agree with you in general where like you mentioned he had a great contested catch rate or a great non-drop rate in college, but his contested catch rate is great too. And I was mentioning on one of the recent Duval Rundown shows that just Parker is really good at that, especially relative to his size, where like I don't think you necessarily want him, again, running like the hitches and the comebacks and all those sideline routes, but you can ask him to like run a route from the slot that goes out to the sideline and to make a contested catch on the sideline against a body. Like that's much more of his game. And so, yeah, that's probably enough Parker Washington talk for now. But yeah, expect bigger things for him going forward. Mia, I think this one is probably for you. Anthony said on YouTube, I was offensive scoring at will. Just a thought.
Yes, we appreciate my old teammate Anthony Bonelli, of course, tuning in from New Jersey for this live show here on the 1010XL Jaguars channel, and he's not wrong. And two things on that front, Gus. Number one, Iowa has no problem establishing it, even bringing in Tim Lester from Western Michigan, and the notion of, oh, they're going to air the ball out more and they're actually going to be a competent offense. You know what led to them becoming a competent offense that now can put up 40 points at will? It's called running the ball. You're seeing a similar situation occurring in Bloomington, Indiana right now. Yes, dare I say it, Nathan Rourke's brother looks great and probably is a dark horse for the Heisman, but so much of it is because of the cohesive offensive operation around him. And that's why when I say Trevor Lawrence is not generational, he could still be a top 10, top 15 quarterback. He just needs to have a solid run game. That's not to belittle him. That's most quarterbacks. That's everybody not named Patrick Mahomes. Have you checked in on C.J. Stroud lately?
Even
folks?
Patrick Mahomes, the Chiefs have the best running game in the NFL by success rate. They're like getting a positive gain, so aka usually 3 or 4 yards or even 5 on like 60% of the runs, which is outrageous. So not that Patrick Mahomes needs it, like I get your point, but even the Chiefs have a great run game. And so, yeah, it's definitely not anything against Trevor Lawrence. Like it's just balance in general is a great thing. You see that in life and in all sports, and including in football when you're just going rush versus pass. And you don't want it to be 50% exactly, because in the modern NFL, you do want to throw a little bit more, but you still want to have a balance. Duval Jags commented on YouTube, I'll get to that one in a second, but someone else said on YouTube, the slot receiver, when you have BTJ, move him around and get the matchup you like. He is the number one, so use him as much. I think that's just a really, really good point. It goes back to what I was kind of saying at the top of the show, where the scheme offensively isn't really putting the players in the best position to succeed. They're just plugging and chugging guys, going next man up based on who they've got, rather than saying Brian Thomas Jr. is an amazing mover and an amazing athlete, and he can do so much more than just winning on like perimeter routes on the sideline. You can really unleash him from the slot, and so that's a good point there. Duval Jags commented on YouTube, how come we didn't run any 12 personnel? Looks good last week. Strangers are non-existent in today's game plan. Yeah, again, the Jaguars, rather than leaning into their player strengths and saying, okay, Brenton Strange is a much, much better NFL player than Austin Trammell, so let's get him onto the field a lot more often. And even if he's not touching the ball more, at least get a much better football player onto the field. But instead, the Jaguars, for whatever reason, they thought that they had an advantage against Vic Fangio's defense, which has always been better in pass defense. They thought they had an advantage trotting out 11 personnel with both Parker Washington and Austin Trammell, 2 sub-6-foot players onto the field. And so, yeah, I don't know why they didn't run any 12 personnel, but I think it's fair to question that.
I honestly think that might be a great place to end it, Gus. Not because we don't want to continue the questions. We appreciate you guys. You could keep the questions even after this is posted and archived on 1010XL Jaguars on YouTube. But I do want to end on that only because I think what you just said hits home of this big conversation we've been having throughout the duration of tonight's program, which is why, when you say our personnel is limited and our best players just so happen to be our best pass catching options, just so happen to be tight ends. And so therefore we should be leaning into said tight ends. But because you go into the game and you say, yeah, but we want to run this type of offense, even if we don't have the personnel for it. What is that? That is once again trying to fit a square peg in a circle hole. And that is an operational and systemic problem in which you're not identifying and adapting to the personnel that you have available. And that is where, if ultimately this is to fall at the feet of Doug Peterson and Shad Khan is to make a decision, if it's to fall at the feet of Trent Baalke, Press Taylor, et cetera, that is what I come back to. The idea of adapting. You have seen across the National Football League in the last 2 years. Hell, go back to week 2 this year when Jordan Love got hurt in the opener and Matt LaFleur ran the ball with Malik Willis how many times for over 200 yards in the first half against the Indianapolis Colts. That's adapting to your skills, to your personnel. That is not saying, okay, I have Malik Willis and now he needs to run the same game plan that I would have given to Jordan Love. that's not realistic in today's modern NFL. You've even seen it from a big picture perspective with how Sean McVay changed his play calling tendencies, how he philosophically changed last year with a young Rams team that he said, you know what? We're no longer going to be this zone read and zone blocking type team because I've got some maulers and I've got Kyron Williams. So we're going to run the ball and we got Puka Nacua and we're going to hit you over the top with it. And that is called adapting to your personnel. And that's where I think so much of the frustration comes from right now.
That's exactly the example that I was going to use. And I think what's important in that specific example is that McVay didn't say, oh, I have all these maulers and I have all of these guys. Let me just use them to the best of their ability. He adapted before that and got the right players in. And so, like, that's an example where you can get guys into your system, but it's when the system is evolving and adapting. McVay had one of the most prolific offenses in NFL history back in, like, 2017 or 2016, maybe 2018. And it was just
2018, 2019. Yeah.
2018, 2019. It was all wide zone runs and then bootlegs and deep explosive passes off of the wide zone runs. And now, like, there are those plays in his playbook still, obviously, since that's kind of his identity, which we talked about on the last Duval Rundown show. But, like, he has adapted so much more that you can barely recognize the 2018, 2019 offense because they run so much more duo and power runs as opposed to zone, and they have so much more true dropbacks as opposed to under center. And it's all adapting with the times of the league and the trends of the league on the defensive side, rather than just saying, you know what, I led the Eagles for their first and only Super Bowl back in 2017. I was coaching Nick Foles. I got him Super Bowl MVP on a trick play. So my system rules, and it doesn't need to change. This can work with Austin Trammell. So, yeah, I agree with you where I think that is a good place to end it. But we've got one more question from our guy Reedy, who's might be a king commenter for us on 1010XL Jaguars. He said that he met BTJ in London, and everyone is correct in that he is a very quiet person. So might that end up leading to him not speaking up to the team? I think this is kind of similar to Trevor Lawrence, where, like, Trevor is a very calm, cool, and collected type of guy who really just doesn't – even when you can definitely see, like, fire in his play from time to time, but he's not like a Ruha guy or whatever you want to call it. We've known that since he entered the league, and I feel like, again, it's similar with BTJ where he's a quiet and reserved guy, but, like, I don't think that anyone should question his leadership skills or his tenacity or his competitiveness whatsoever because of that. So do you have anything to add for that?
Yeah, he's a gamer. I'll tell you that. In practice, yes, I was right there with you, Reedy. In training camp, I'm like, a little worried if you can't show me the alpha on the practice field. Will we see it on the game field? And obviously, from the moment he stepped into game action in the preseason to now, he is that guy. He is an alpha number one wide receiver. Now, is he ultimately going to prove to be one of those quieter wide receivers? I would argue Justin Jefferson, Devontae Adams aren't necessarily the trash-talking Tyreek Hill, loud in your face, brash wide receiver one that kind of has become the stereotypical, well, this is what you want from your wide receiver. I don't think he's ever going to be that. And I think that's okay. And I actually think it's a good thing because
is that what people want? I don't mean to interrupt, but it feels like every type of the receiver ends up just, like, requesting a trade at some point. So it's
that's true. That's true. I mean, I guess, like, yeah, you know, when you go through the line, yeah. So we don't want that. But point being, you guys want that guy who has that dog in him. He has that dog in him.
Yep.
He talks a lot of smack on the field, and his play lives up to it. And I do think, yes, it is something that you look at and you're like, oh my goodness, like, he's so quiet. I'm sure you all saw it at the end of the game. He had the towel over his head. This is a guy who was beat up. He still found a way to play today. I know he had 2 catches for 22 yards on 4 targets. Ultimately, they probably should have targeted him more. But he is a guy who cares, and they need guys who care, especially right now at 2-7.
Yeah, well, the Trevor Lawrence to Brian Thomas Jr. connection is definitely going to be one of the few things to look forward to each Sunday throughout the rest of the season as the Jaguars fell to 2-7 today against the Philadelphia Eagles in Doug Peterson's second homecoming game in Philly. So that was that. That was episode 27 of Duval Rundown. We'll be back on Tuesday at noon with guest to be determined. Randy just asked, what if BTJ asked for a trade? Stop now. We got to get out.
Randy, we got to go. Don't put that evil on us.
Thank you to everyone who joined. Thank you for everyone who will be back here on Tuesday. Thank you to Mia and Hacker for joining. Until next time, everyone. Thank you.